Lowe's knows that more projects mean more tools. For a limited time, new and existing My Lowe's Rewards credit card members can get 12-month special financing on purchases of $299 or more, in-store and online. Don't wait to get the things you need. Get special financing today. Lowe's. We help. You save. Now through August 27th, choose 12-month special financing on purchases of $299 or more. Offer subject to credit approval and cannot be combined. Minimum monthly payments required. See store at Lowe's.com for details.
What's up, everybody? You are listening to the Strength and Knowledge Podcast. I'm Dr. Zach Baker, and I have with me Dr. Corey Jones, Director of Clinical Excellence and one of our PTs here at Rehab to Perform. And we're going to talk today about ACL rehab, and specifically neurocognitive aspects of ACL rehab. And this is something that is becoming more mainstream. You're starting to hear that neurocognitive rehab buzzword a little bit more, not only in the ACL world, but just in all of your return to sport aspects of rehab for various injuries and pathologies. And I feel like we're just scratching the surface with it. We know it's important. We know we should be doing it, but we're just now starting to get some, I don't want to say definitive answers, but better guidelines and recommendations on how we can do this effectively. And that's what I want to talk about today is really what is neurocognitive rehab. And for people who are still in school or they are new to their career, being able to really articulate this a little bit better and have a general understanding of what they're trying to do with it. Also understand, why do we need this? Why should we be incorporating this into our programming? And then the million-dollar question, how do we do this? How do we do this from an intervention standpoint in early and late phase rehab effectively? And then is there also anything that we can do from a testing standpoint to supplement what we're already doing? So, Corey, I'll let you do the honors of this and start off just when you hear neurocognitive rehab, what does that come to mind? How would you kind of define that, or how would you wrap your head around that term?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to think about is going back to your neurology understanding from school. A lot of times ortho and neuro has been so separate, but we can't do that because it's one brain, one body. So whether we're talking psych influences, neuro influence, cardiovascular, whatever. So we're starting to see more and more in ACL rehab that we need to consider the systems as a whole. So the crazy thing about the brain is it is locked in a tiny skull. It's a dark cave. There's nothing going on in there unless we utilize those five senses. So if we're talking about the amazing creation of what humans are, it's people that can integrate what's happening in the environment. And then as a result of that environment and that context, make decisions about moving and about being physical beings and about creating any of these movement patterns that for us, the fun part is sports. So it's really talking about the fact that the brain knows absolutely nothing until it gets information from the outside. And so what we've seen in a lot of the research lately is that especially that visual input is huge. So what we're seeing is really integrated in the brain to help us make decisions as to how to move or how far to move or how high to jump or whatever. So because that's so integrated, we need to start addressing it as part of rehab. The other thing that they're finding in research is that it is something that is changed or altered. I don't want to say damaged, but it's different after an injury. So since we're seeing that sensory integration is different, guess what? It's part of that rehab. It's part of our KPIs to see if we can make it a little bit better through what we're doing in that rehab process. So not only what does our vision tell us to do, but also what does it tell us not to do? So sometimes it's a go situation and sometimes it's a no-go situation. Like it's telling us not to move here. So it's really, really a fascinating part of what really makes people, number one, good athletes and good at sport, but it's also something that hopefully will down the line lead to less injury rates and smaller incidences of re-tears. So we'll see in the future as studies come out.
Whenever I think of neurocognitive rehab, I always think about how do we add layers onto a given task. And I think we do a really good job in the field of figuring out what are the demands of a task from a range of motion standpoint, from a strength standpoint, from an energy system standpoint, and how do we create a drill that mimics those demands. The unfortunate part is when we go back to sport or when we go back to life, things aren't operating in a vacuum like that. There's other external factors that are going to be influenced. And that's where you talk about all these different senses that come into play. So what kind of visual input are we getting in this given environment while we're trying to do that task? What type of auditory input are we getting? What type of sensory input? What type of cognitive demands or problems do we need to solve in addition to the tasks that we're trying to do? So think about a wide receiver. If they're running a go route, they know that their body has to run in a straight line as fast as they can to try to get open. But what their brain also has to do is recognize, where's the defense? Is this zone coverage? Where's the high safety at? Has the ball been released? How much time is it? Where's the down and distance? Is there a certain spot on the field I need to get to? There's a lot of other decisions that happen in addition to just how fast can I run and how quickly can I get there? So I always think of neurocognitive rehab, it's kind of like adding layers to the equation, more variables to the equation that we're trying to solve. And can we do this in a logical, systematic manner when it's predictable or unpredictable? And I think, Corey, with that, if you can elaborate on, why do we need neurocognitive rehab, or how else would you expand on, why is it relevant in this rehab environment when we talk about returning to everyday activities, returning to work, or ultimately returning to sport and higher level activities?
This kind of comes back to if you've ever seen the learning period. Anytime you're learning movement, there's a point of time, the very base of the pyramid is basically an unconscious incompetence. We don't know what we're doing wrong / dangerous or whatever, and we don't know that we're doing it. So we're incompetent and unconscious. Then we have to move into now I know about it. So it's a conscious incompetence. I still can't really fix it, but I'm at least conscious of it. Then we go to this conscious competence. So I know how to fix it and I'm conscious of doing that. But sport is an unconscious competence. I can have my brain thinking about other things, like you just said, the defense, the strategy, what the opponent is doing, what my coach is yelling at me. I have to be able to have my brain and my higher level function thinking about all of these other things and not thinking about my body. So sometimes we talk about it as like a top down or bottom up cognitive understanding. So top down, hey, we don't want our executive function to be wasted on how my knee is moving whenever I'm running and how I'm landing and this kind of thing, because it should be occupied with other things. So we're looking for more of a bottom up competency where I don't have to be thinking about my knee because I've trained it in a way that it moves well and it moves efficiently and it has many, many movement options. And so it's adaptable no matter what's happening because my executive function, my cognition is dealing with other things. So I think it just becomes very important because if we can get somebody to an unconscious competency, we know they have the strength, the stability, the understanding that their eyes and their brain can be taking in these other parts of the environment. They can be dual tasking without it impacting the effectiveness or efficiency of the movement pattern. So we've done testing and stuff to see, hey, if I have somebody doing dual task issues while performing a particular movement pattern, you can see the quality of that movement change. So it's really, really interesting because if we can make somebody have very great adaptability, a ton of movement options, and they're stable and mobile in all of these different places, honestly, what the research shows is they're less likely to get injured. So the big thing is we want people not only to get back and not get injured again, but to also perform at the level that they were performing at prior to injury. So the best thing we can do is make sure they're not only competent with, like you said, the orthopedic side of things, but also the neurological go and no-go situations or capacity to inhibit these other things that are going on in order to move forward. Because even some little things hey, if there's a visual and auditory cue, our brain has to decide which one's more important at that moment. And then even tougher than that is there's two different visual cues occurring. Which one do I pay more attention to? We want our brain making decisions based on those things and not worried about what the knee is doing or what the situation is that my body is actually moving in itself.
No, I love that. Now, this kind of brings us to the $1 million question. We know what it is. We know that it's important. How the heck do we do this within a rehab protocol. And there's certain things that we're very familiar with and very comfortable with in ACL rehab. And it's, pretty universally known of what certain things should and shouldn't be done in early, mid, and late phase. But how can we incorporate some of this neurocognitive rehab into the earlier phases? And then what are some other ways that we can incorporate it with interventions in the later phases? And things that I always think about and that are frustrating as a clinician, in the beginning phases, you always have a ceiling in regards to what you're allowed to do. Maybe you can't move too far, or maybe you can't use too much force or move too quickly. You have all these parameters because you have a healing environment that you're trying to facilitate and you're trying to foster. If you do too much, it can be catastrophic. So we always have this cap on certain aspects of rehab of what we're allowed to do. And I really think that's kind of like the cheat code for how we can introduce some of that neurocognitive rehab. And then at the end phases, I always think about, when is enough when we talk about like speed development, strength development, conditioning, and when do we just need more variety, or when do we need some more realistic input or stimulus to help bridge that gap back to sport specificity. And Corey, I'd love to hear your thoughts on just either strategies you've incorporated or things that you've read or seen that you think are really effective to do early phase, and then maybe in like middle or later phases.
Yeah. So again, this is where the researchers are helping us a ton. Originally, I think it was Matt Taberner that started to talk about like the control to chaos continuum. So like kind of what you were talking about before, having an environment that's pretty predictable, pretty understandable, pretty low key with not a lot of competing things going on. And then eventually, as you return to sport is the most chaotic environment because there's just so much going on. So he kind of introduced this control to chaos continuum that's been really helpful in thinking about these like early to late stages. And then the cool thing is I think it was Meredith Chaput and a couple other ones have come up with a guide almost that's the visual cognitive control to chaos continuum. So it's really helpful because then it's taking, like you're saying, it's taking these visual cognitive things and putting it even in the earliest stages. They say that you need to start this as soon as possible so that the brain is already tuned into this capacity to dual task from like literally day one, week one. So the continuum kind of starts with high control where there's no visual cognitive dual task. You're just exercising. So that might be like a straight leg raise or something like that. And then it leads to like moderate control. So now you have like a single step visually displayed working memory kind of challenge. So now you're actually asking them to do something based on what they're seeing. So an example that was given for this one was kind of like you have a straight leg raise at a pace based on maybe like a blinking screen. So they have to lift their leg at the same pace as a blinking screen. So that's kind of like a simple, hey, I have to follow this, but my eyes are determining how quickly I'm moving. And then like there's a control to chaos. So like now there's two-step processing and stuff like that. So that might just be like a straight leg raise, which again is pretty boring exercise, but can we add, hey, maybe they're looking at a Stroop deck. So like when blue is the color of the background and the word, they're doing a isometric contraction. Or if blue is the word that's written, but it's written in yellow, so it's like, a little bit of a decision-making piece there. Now they're doing isotonic movement. So they're doing 3 straight leg raises in a row. So it starts introducing this like, oh, I have to make a decision based on what I'm seeing, which is really interesting. So then we've got like this moderate chaos where we're making it even harder. There's multi-step processing and maybe some like go, no go. So maybe there's a certain color where it's telling them to not move their leg at all. And they have to make the decision to inhibit what they're actually doing. And then it leads to that high chaos, like where there's cross-modal sensory integration. There's a lot going on. Maybe there's unanticipated reactions. Maybe you're giving them little perturbations while they're doing this straight leg raise and making all these decisions. So obviously you're trying to get to chaotic, but the cool thing is you can use that whole continuum for a straight leg raise, which is early phase. It's boring as heck. But can we make it something that really is starting to train the brain to make decisions, not based on how the leg is moving, but instead what the brain and what the eyes are seeing. And then obviously you can take that into other things. Gosh, you could take that into your squats later on, your lunges. You can take that into plyometrics. Like there's just so much input that you can give. And the more frequent that you're doing this throughout the continuum, the more regular this visual cognitive decision-making becomes, so that the body's so familiar with it. And then there's way better movement patterns, and you're seeing this carryover session to session. So kind of cool to see that continuum throughout the span being able to use really early. But then the fun thing about return to sport is once we get to those late phases, now we're making it really particular to the sport. Like you gave a football example. I'm a soccer player. So for soccer, it might be like, hey, I'm really trying to read the trajectory of a corner kick. And where I move and what I'm doing is based on what my eyes are telling me about the ball. So I'm going to start making more of these decision-making things, the go and no-go, based on where a soccer ball is flying and based on where a defender's on my back. Luckily at R2P, we have a lot of students, so we can set up some of these situations where there's a lot more decision-making based on who's around you and stuff. But yeah, I think that continuum really makes it accessible so that you can always manipulate your exercises no matter what phase of rehab you're in.
And I like how you mentioned, one, the research supports introducing it early and starting tapping into some of those pathways early on. I think in earlier phases of rehab, things unfortunately can be boring. And a lot of the gains that you see are often volume based. So, hey, you want to get more range of motion, you got to do a lot of reps of this to start getting that thing moving. Hey, you want to reestablish some of that neuromuscular re-ed, we need to get a lot of reps at progressively higher intensities to start recruiting more motor units. And it can be boring doing the same thing over and over and over. So any way that you can gamify some of those activities or add some other stimulus, I think the patients appreciate that, and it becomes more engaging for them. And then I love how you mentioned you're inevitably going to incorporate this, I think, somewhat more naturally as you get into later phases of rehab. I think when we get into return to sport, we understand thinking about things less from an anticipatory environment and more of a reactive environment. And we start adding in all these other dual tasking elements a little bit more naturally than we do with our earlier phase rehab, because it fits in with stuff we're more comfortable and familiar with. If you can introduce some of these dual tasking elements earlier on, it streamlines your sessions as a clinician later on because they've already gained familiarity with it. And they know what you've asked them to do with different types of stimulus in early phases of rehab. And you can carry that through. Maybe you're doing some of that visual recognition where they're making decisions based off what you're showing them. If you've done that for them in a more controlled environment at earlier phases, then you just need to change the exercise later on. And now your straight leg raise is your squat or whatever, your plyo activity. But I don't know if you have any thoughts there, Corey, but I love that.
Yeah, and I think the other cool thing, kind of going back to the research on that, is like we talk in motor control about blocked versus random practice. Blocked practice is where you're just trying to teach somebody something and you're doing that repetitiously, right? You're doing it over and over like you were saying before. But true learning happens once you get to random practice. So in the past, we've really thought about that. And like, let's say it's a squat. I'm going to have somebody split squat, lateral squat. I'm going to have them neutral squat and heels elevated squat. I am learning the movement pattern in all these different contexts, right? But now, like what we're learning about this visual cognitive side of things is how, gosh, we can vary that environment and we can vary what input is being given to the visual system in so many different ways. So not only is the patient having a little bit more fun, maybe we are, because you can be so creative with this. I mean, the tools, there's just so many different tools. You're talking working with like Hiko sticks or vector balls. Maybe you're using different colors of dice. Maybe you're doing Stroop tests. Maybe you're using math flashcards where they're having to read a math equation and tell you the answer as they're doing different things. Again, like in the past, we've done a little bit of that dual tasking verbally. But what they're finding is rather than having somebody count backwards by fives or do a math equation in their head, it's way more impactful if they are seeing it visually and then having to make a decision based on what they're seeing as they're doing these movement patterns. So again, the research has just been so cool to read because we're seeing some of these things that, like you're saying, early stage, there's not a lot going on, but this makes it, hey, there's so much more that you can do to make it entertaining, but also impactful for down the road. So that random practice and motor control really starts building to the point where I do truly know how to load my knee and know how to load it well, because as I'm doing all these visual cognitive exercises, I am watching how my patient is moving and seeing if they're proficient or not. If dual tasking is what makes the movement pattern break down, there you go. That's my answer. They're not quite ready to move on to the next phase, or they're not quite ready to move on from where we're at. We still have work to do. And again, it turns into this, hey, we've added this to the battery of things that we're looking at in order to determine proficiency. So it's really helpful, especially in those early stages, to understand when I can progress into that next phase.
Now, and then the last thing that I just wanted to cover before we wrap up here, are there any easy ways that we can implement this into some of our testing? And whether that's formal or informal, how can we utilize neurocognitive demands or dual tasking to give us more information about how an individual moves or potentially how they're going to perform?
Yeah, so again, like the cool thing is it's relatively easy. There's a lot of research coming out about very specific tests. Like one is a visual cognitive lateral single leg hop test. So there's some things that are backed already by like the research they're doing. But the cool thing is almost any test that you would normally do, you can just add this visual cognitive task while they're performing it. And then you can see if it's different in two different ways. Sometimes it's qualitatively. So as you're watching them perform the movement, does it change? So for example, we do a heel tap test from a step here at R2P. So they're on a 6-inch step. They're doing heel taps. We're seeing right to left how many they can do to look at LSI, but also to look at quality of loading a single leg limb. You could literally just have them doing a single leg heel tap. And as they're performing that, look at that movement or video it even, and then have them do a second trial where they have a visual cognitive task that they're performing while doing that, and see, does that movement change? Does it look different? Is the quality, poorer? Or, for example, you can do quantitative differences. So the lateral hop test that we were just talking about, they're on one leg, see how far they can jump to the side, and then maybe give them a visual cognitive input of some sort. So they have math flashcards that they're looking at, and they have to tell you what the answer is as they're performing the hop. So they're kind of calculating as they hop. And does the distance change? Do they not quite hop as far because their brain's busy doing other things and their eyes trying to intake other things? And that could be anything. You could make it a color-based task, again, a Stroop-based test. You could alter these things as long as you're consistently performing it the same way every time, so that you have a standard, obviously, that you're kind of like using month to month. Then you can really see some of this proficiency. So it's kind of cool because you can add this dual tasking to a lot of things pretty easily, as long as you're consistent and as long as you're looking at it both qualitatively and quantitatively. So yeah, pretty easy to kind of see, are they actually learning this movement pattern or not?
Awesome. Corey, I appreciate all the thoughts regarding this topic. If you are listening to this and you are new to the topic, I'd encourage you to get into the research. There is ongoing research in regards to best ways to implement this from a treatment standpoint and from a testing standpoint. I think the easiest entry point is just recognize that it's out there. And if you haven't been incorporating this at all, pick some low risk and simple ways to introduce it with your early phase rehab. And then as you get more comfortable with it, how you introduce it, how you coach it, how you cue it, getting a sample size of what is acceptable levels of deviation. When you introduce one of these tasks, do they fail? Do they do poorly? How poorly do they do? Get comfortable with how it influences the task in low risk environments before you have them do it on that later phase end of the spectrum. So for those listening, if you enjoyed this episode, please share, like, and subscribe. You are listening to the Strength and Knowledge Podcast. I'm Dr. Zach Baker. With us today was Dr. Corey Jones. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for next episode.